My ex stood in court and said, "My son wants to live with me." The judge turned to my son and asked, "Is that true?" He stood up, pulled out his phone, and said, "May I play the recording from last night?" The judge froze. The courtroom felt colder than usual, or maybe it was just the tension clinging to Rachel's skin like frost. She tightened her grip on her son's hand, her fingers interlacing with his smaller ones, as they stepped into the dimly lit family court of Jefferson County. Ethan Parker, barely 13 but standing tall with a quiet defiance in his posture, walked beside her with measured steps. His sneakers squeaked slightly against the polished floor, drawing Rachel's attention to just how small he still was in a world demanding so much of him. On the other side of the room, Daniel Parker stood near his attorney's table, arms crossed with a practiced calm that bordered on arrogance. His suit was pressed to perfection, his hair combed back, his jaw clean-shaven. Rachel had once loved that jawline, that calm demeanor. Now it felt more like a mask. She saw it crack ever so slightly when he noticed Ethan clutching her hand. Daniel's smile, quick and thin, disappeared as fast as it had come. The judge, a gray-haired man named Judge Franklin Holloway, entered the room precisely at 9 o'clock in the morning. His black robe trailed as he took his seat behind the high bench, his glasses low on the bridge of his nose. The courtroom, a blend of aging wood and dusty sunlight streaming through tall windows, settled into a hush. "Good morning," the judge began, his voice neutral but firm. "Today, we reconvene to hear the final arguments regarding the custody case of Ethan Parker. After 1 year of proceedings, filings, and testimonies, the court expects to reach a conclusive decision by the end of today's session." Rachel swallowed hard. 1 year. 365 days of mediations, evaluations, character assessments, and lawyer bills that stacked higher than she cared to count. Through it all, Ethan had remained mostly silent, never asked to speak, never required to. Until now. She sat beside her attorney, a woman named Claire Bowman, whose steady hands flipped through the case notes with ease. Across the aisle, Daniel's attorney, Jack Greeley, tapped his pen rhythmically, already eyeing Judge Holloway as if preparing a closing statement in his mind. "Before we begin," Judge Holloway continued, "I want to remind both parties that the purpose of this court is the well-being of the child. Not convenience. Not ego. Not revenge. I will be listening carefully." Ethan shifted in his seat but didn't look at anyone. His eyes remained fixed on the empty table in front of him. Rachel leaned slightly toward him, whispering, "Whatever happens, I'm proud of you." He nodded without looking at her. The judge turned to the attorneys. "Mr. Greeley, you may proceed with your final statement." Jack Greeley stood up smoothly, buttoning his jacket before he approached the center. His voice was calm, his pace rehearsed. "Your Honor, my client, Daniel Parker, has maintained from the beginning that his son's best interest is at the heart of this petition. Ethan has expressed, in conversations with his father, a desire to live with him full-time. Mr. Parker provides a stable home, a flexible work schedule, and a nurturing environment. We believe that Ethan has not only voiced this preference clearly but also understands the implications of such a decision." Rachel's breath caught in her throat. She turned to look at Ethan, whose expression hadn't changed. His eyes were still distant, unreadable. Claire leaned toward her, whispering, "They're playing the same card." "Stay calm." Judge Holloway lifted an eyebrow. "Are you saying the child has made a definitive request to live with his father?" Greeley nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." In Mr. Parker's words, Ethan told him just that only days ago. The judge turned his gaze toward the boy. The room, though filled with a dozen people, bailiff, clerks, attorneys, felt suddenly intimate, as if the oxygen had been sucked out. Even Daniel straightened slightly, eyes locked on his son. "Ethan," the judge said gently, "is that true? Do you want to live with your father?" Rachel's heart pounded so loud in her ears that she almost missed the long silence that followed. Ethan didn't answer right away. He blinked slowly, then looked up for the first time, his eyes meeting the judge's directly. He stood, pushing his chair back with a soft scrape. "Your Honor," he said, his voice calm but clear, "may I play a recording from last night?" The words sliced through the air like a blade. Even Rachel couldn't mask her surprise. She turned to Ethan in disbelief, but he didn't look at her. Daniel stiffened, blinking quickly, as if trying to piece together what his son had just said. Judge Holloway blinked, taken aback. A recording? From last night? Ethan nodded. Yes, sir. From my phone. There was a murmur from both sides of the courtroom. Claire immediately stood, addressing the judge. Your Honor, if I may. But Holloway raised a hand. Let the boy speak. Daniel looked directly at Ethan now, a mix of confusion and dread beginning to form behind his eyes. Rachel's instinct screamed at her. Something had happened, something she didn't know about. Do you have the recording? The judge asked. Ethan nodded again. It's right here. It's about 2 minutes long. There was a pause. Holloway looked toward the bailiff. Please bring the phone forward. I'll listen first before determining if it's admissible. Ethan handed over the phone without hesitation. His hands didn't shake. The bailiff brought it to the bench. The judge inserted earbuds and pressed play. What followed was a silence thicker than before, not because the courtroom was quiet, but because the weight of something unspoken had begun to settle. Rachel could see the judge's expression shift as he listened. From curious to tense. From tense to visibly disturbed. He stopped the recording before the 2 minutes were up, pulling the earbuds out and placing them on the bench. He looked at Ethan again, then to Rachel. Then to Daniel. I need to speak with the child in private, Judge Holloway said sharply. We'll take a short recess. Bailiff, clear the room. The gavel struck once. The noise echoed through the chamber. As the courtroom emptied, Rachel stared at her son, who finally turned toward her. There was no fear in his eyes, only quiet resolve. She realized, in that moment, that her son had come prepared not just to tell the truth, but to expose it. When the courtroom reconvened nearly 20 minutes later, a tense quietness blanketed every corner of the space. The judge had not yet returned, and everyone seemed to hold their breath. Rachel sat frozen, still trying to grasp the weight of Ethan's sudden decision to bring a recording. She hadn't known about it, he had kept it hidden from her too. Her mind raced. What else had he experienced? What else had he heard? Daniel returned from the hallway a few minutes after Rachel and Ethan were seated. His pace was slow, and for the first time since the trial had begun, his face showed more than just controlled expressions. He looked shaken. His lips pressed tightly, his gaze downward. He no longer carried the same composure that had accompanied him earlier. Jack Greeley tried whispering something to him, but Daniel didn't respond. Rachel caught a glimpse of her son's profile. Ethan was seated straight, but not stiff. He was still, focused, his expression unreadable. It was that same look he had started wearing after the separation, a look that didn't belong on a 13-year-old. The door behind the judge's bench opened, and Judge Holloway walked back in, this time with more weight in his movements. He didn't glance at anyone until he reached his chair and looked across the room. Then, without fanfare or delay, he said, Mr. Parker, would you please rise? Daniel stood slowly, his hands clasped in front of him. I have just heard a conversation between you and your son recorded last night. For the record, I am not making a ruling at this moment. But I do want to ask, before we proceed, do you deny the authenticity of that audio? There was a beat. Daniel's eyes flicked to Ethan for the briefest second. Your Honor, that recording was taken out of context. Holloway's eyes narrowed slightly. What was the context, then? Daniel hesitated. I was frustrated. My son had been giving mixed signals, and I was trying to make him understand how important it is to choose what's best for his future. I might have raised my voice. You threatened him, the judge said flatly. You told him he would regret his decision if he said he wanted to live with his mother. That if he chose her, he would lose everything. Daniel's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Judge Holloway leaned back in his chair. That is not the voice of a frustrated parent. That is the voice of coercion. I need to be very clear, what I heard constitutes manipulation and psychological pressure. That alone shifts the foundation of this hearing. Rachel stared at Daniel as the words fell, one after the other. She wasn't surprised, not entirely. But hearing a judge call it out with such clarity, it was both a vindication and a blow. Greeley stood to interject. "Your Honor, if I may." "No," the judge cut him off. "We are not spinning this. I'm not interested in legal maneuvering. We are now dealing with evidence of behavior that directly impacts the emotional well-being of a minor. And I intend to understand the full scope of it." He turned to Rachel's attorney. "Ms. Bowman, you mentioned previously that there may be supporting evidence. Do you wish to present it now?" Claire rose. "Yes, Your Honor. We request permission to submit digital evidence, including text messages, call logs, and other voice recordings that demonstrate a pattern of intimidation and manipulation toward Ethan." The judge nodded. "Proceed." Claire pulled a small USB from her folder and handed it to the bailiff, who took it to the clerk's desk. As the files loaded onto the court's projection system, the lights dimmed slightly. The first exhibit appeared, a screenshot of a message from Daniel to Ethan, timestamped just a week prior. It read, "Don't forget who really takes care of you. If you want to keep enjoying your weekends, you'll make the right choice in court." Another followed, "Your mother can't teach you how to be a man. You need to stop clinging to her." More texts piled on the screen, some subtle, some overt. They painted a picture of control, of a man trying to bend his son's will through guilt, fear, and shame. Rachel sat rigid, but her heart broke with each new message. She had seen some of these before, had tried to talk to Ethan about them. He always shrugged, said it wasn't a big deal. Now, under the cold clarity of court, they screamed louder than ever. Then came a second recording, another phone call, this one from 3 weeks earlier. Daniel's voice was lower, calmer, but no less piercing. "If you screw this up, Ethan, your mom's going to drag you down with her. You think she can give you a future? She's weak. She's always been weak." Gasps echoed quietly from the gallery. Even the clerk seemed shaken. When the audio ended, Judge Holloway let silence settle for a full 30 seconds. Then, with slow, deliberate words, he said, "This court has now seen multiple instances of emotional coercion directed at a minor. I will be calling for an independent psychological evaluation immediately. This hearing will continue, but from this point forward, all testimony involving the child will be handled with a heightened level of protection." Rachel exhaled slowly. It wasn't over. But the tide was turning. The judge looked at Ethan again. "I will not ask you to speak again unless you wish to. Do you understand?" Ethan nodded once. "Yes, sir. Would you like to say anything at this time?" Ethan looked at his mother, then at his father. Then back at the judge. "I just want it to stop," he said quietly. "I want to stop feeling like I have to choose between what I feel and what will keep him from getting mad." There was another silence. Holloway didn't speak immediately. His expression softened, then grew stern once again. "We'll break for lunch," he finally said. "When we return, I will hear from both counsel regarding next steps." He stood. The gavel dropped again. As people began to shuffle out of the room, Rachel leaned over to Ethan. "You okay?" He nodded, this time with a bit more certainty. "Yeah. I'm glad it's out there now." Rachel wanted to wrap him in her arms and never let go, but she didn't. Not here. Instead, she gently touched his back and guided him out of the room. Daniel didn't look at them as they passed. His eyes were fixed on the table, unmoving. Outside the courtroom, the world felt just as heavy, but something had changed. Rachel could feel it in her son's steps, in the way his shoulders sat a little higher. The truth had begun to unfold. And there was no turning back. The courtroom lights dimmed once more after the recess, and the projector screen flickered to life. Judge Holloway had requested that the full contents of Ethan's original recording, the one he had tried to play before the recess, be heard in court, with all parties present. Rachel sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, knuckles pale, while Ethan remained still beside her, his face unreadable but calm. Claire leaned in and reminded him softly that he didn't need to speak again unless asked, but Ethan didn't respond. He simply stared at the screen ahead. The bailiff connected the audio file to the court's sound system. There were no images this time. Just a black screen and a single white line vibrating with the sound waves as the recording began. It started with casual background noise, the hum of a television, faint movement in a room. Then, Daniel's voice cut through. "You don't get to sit there and pretend this is easy, Ethan." There was no context, no introduction. The tone was sharp, brittle. "You think just saying you want to stay with your mom makes everything okay? You think that's how this works?" A pause, and Ethan's smaller voice replied, clearly nervous but still trying to stay calm. "I didn't say that, I just said I'm not sure." "Not sure?" Daniel interrupted, his voice rising. "You're 13. You don't get to be unsure. You're not a kid anymore. You need to start thinking like a man." The silence that followed was deafening. In the courtroom, Rachel glanced sideways at Daniel. He sat motionless, jaw tense, eyes fixed on the screen but not seeing it. His attorney had stopped taking notes. The recording continued. "I'm telling you now, if you say that in court, if you tell them you want to stay with her, you're going to regret it. You'll lose everything. I won't protect you from what comes after." Ethan's voice came again, this time lower, more afraid. "What does that mean?" Daniel didn't answer immediately in the recording. There was a pause, a long one, followed by the sound of a chair scraping. "It means I won't fight for you anymore. I won't keep making sacrifices. You'll see what it's like when your mom has to handle everything without me cleaning up behind her. When you get tired of watching her fall apart, don't come running back." Then came the sound of a door slamming. The audio clicked off, ending as suddenly as it began. No one in the courtroom moved. Judge Holloway reached for his glasses, taking them off slowly and placing them on the bench. He looked at the boy in front of him, then at Rachel, and finally at Daniel. "I have heard enough." Daniel's attorney stood. "Your Honor, again, this is a heated moment taken out of. Mr. Greeley, if you say the words context or frustration one more time, I will hold you in contempt. Sit down." The courtroom was absolutely silent. Rachel finally exhaled, her chest shaking as the air left her lungs. Ethan kept his eyes down, fingers loosely interlocked in front of him. Judge Holloway spoke again, his voice lower now, but colder. "What we just heard was not a mistake. It was not a one-time lapse in judgment. It was deliberate, targeted emotional pressure. The child asked a question and was met with conditional love. Threats disguised as parenting." He turned to the clerk. "This recording will be entered into evidence. Mark it accordingly." Then he looked back at Ethan. "You are not required to comment, but I want to give you the opportunity. If there's anything else you'd like the court to understand, now is the time." Ethan lifted his head slowly. His voice, when it came, was quiet but steady. "That wasn't the first time. That's just the first time I recorded it. I didn't know if it would help, but I didn't know what else to do." Claire leaned forward and whispered, "You don't have to say more." But Ethan continued, eyes locked on the judge. "He doesn't yell all the time. Sometimes it's worse when he's quiet. When he says things that make me feel like I'm the reason everything is wrong. That I owe him. That mom's life is my fault because I chose her." Daniel visibly flinched at that, but Judge Holloway didn't shift his gaze. "I don't want to have to pick sides. But every time I try to be fair, he gets angry. Every time I don't say what he wants, he reminds me that he pays for everything, or that mom isn't strong enough. But she is. She doesn't say mean things about him to me. She just listens." He paused. "I just want to live in a house where I don't have to be scared of choosing the wrong words. There was no sound except for the gentle tapping of the court stenographer's keys. Even the spectators in the back of the room remained frozen. Rachel reached out slowly and placed her hand over Ethan's, gripping it tightly. The judge finally nodded. "Thank you, Ethan." He turned to both attorneys. "The nature of this hearing has changed. I am requesting a formal investigation into the psychological safety of continued visitation, and I will be appointing a child psychologist to conduct a full evaluation, effective immediately. We will reconvene in 72 hours to determine the interim custody arrangements." Daniel's face had gone pale. Greeley whispered something to him again, this time with more insistence, but Daniel remained quiet. The gavel dropped again, ending the session. As the courtroom emptied, Rachel and Ethan remained seated for a moment. No one rushed them. No one interrupted. "You did so well," she whispered, brushing her hand gently along the side of his face. Ethan turned to her, finally showing a flicker of emotion behind his calm. "Do you think they believe me?" She smiled softly, not with joy but with recognition. "I think they finally see what I've known all along." As they walked out, Daniel stood near the door, unmoving. His eyes met Ethan's for a moment. There was no anger there this time. Just something unreadable, something that looked, if only faintly, like the beginning of consequence. But Rachel didn't stop, and neither did Ethan. The truth was no longer buried in private phone calls or unspoken threats. It was out in the open now, echoing in the walls of a courtroom that had begun to shift its weight, not toward the louder voice, but toward the one that had stayed quiet for too long. The psychologist arrived at the courthouse the following morning, accompanied by a caseworker from the Department of Child Services. The court had moved swiftly after the audio revelations, and Judge Holloway had made it clear in his post-hearing orders that this stage of the process would not be treated as procedural formality. Ethan was to undergo a private evaluation with the court-appointed psychologist in a secured, neutral setting on the courthouse grounds. Both parents were to remain in the building but away from the interview room. They were forbidden from having any communication with Ethan until the session concluded. Rachel sat in a private waiting area, her eyes fixed on the large digital clock that hung above the courthouse cafeteria doors. The hands seemed to move slower than normal, dragging time with them. Claire sat beside her, flipping through emails on her phone, trying not to project the same level of tension. "I just want him to be okay," Rachel said softly, eyes never leaving the clock. "He will be," Claire replied. "He's handled everything so far with more maturity than most adults. He's going to speak the truth. And from what I've seen, that's already begun to matter to this judge." Rachel nodded, but worry still clouded her expression. It wasn't about court strategy or legal language now. It was about her son, seated in a room with a stranger, being asked to untangle emotions that most grown men refuse to admit aloud. And she couldn't help him this time. Down the hallway, Ethan sat opposite a woman in her late 40s, with sharp, intelligent eyes behind silver-rimmed glasses and a notebook resting on her lap. Her name was Dr. Amanda Kessler, and she had introduced herself with a calm, professional warmth. She explained to Ethan that nothing he said would be used against him, that he was not on trial, and that her job was to understand what he was feeling, not to tell him what to feel. Ethan, quiet but attentive, nodded. "Ethan," she began gently, "I know yesterday was a hard day. But you were very brave." He looked down, shifting his feet under the chair. "I didn't want to lie." "That's very important," she said. "Can I ask, when did you start to feel like you couldn't say how you really felt around your father?" Ethan thought for a moment before answering. "It wasn't always like that. Before the divorce, he was different. Not nicer, just quieter. He used to work a lot, and he didn't pay much attention to me. Then when Mom left, he started wanting to talk all the time, but only when it was about court stuff. He'd get mad if I said the wrong thing. Do you remember the first time he got upset like that?" He hesitated. "I think it was when I told him I wanted to go to Mom's for Thanksgiving. He said I was being disloyal, that she tricked me. He didn't yell. He just stopped talking to me for the rest of the weekend." "And how did that make you feel?" "Like I messed up. Like I had to fix it." Amanda nodded slowly, jotting down a few words in her notebook. What do you mean by fix it? I mean, say the things he wanted. So he wouldn't get mad again. Amanda leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice. Do you ever feel unsafe with your father? Ethan's eyes flicked up to her, and his mouth opened slightly, then closed again. It took several seconds before he responded. Not like he's going to hit me, he said. But like I have to watch everything I say. Or he'll make me feel like I'm a bad person. Or like I don't love him enough. Amanda wrote that down without reacting. That's very honest, Ethan. Do you ever feel that way with your mom? He shook his head. She doesn't say stuff like that. If I get upset, she just lets me talk. She doesn't try to change my mind. Amanda paused, then continued in a softer tone. Do you think your father loves you? Ethan nodded quickly. Yeah. I think he does. But, it feels like he only shows it when I agree with him. Amanda gave him a gentle smile. And how do you feel when you're with your mom? Safe, Ethan said immediately. Even when she's sad or tired, I don't feel like I have to be someone else. I don't feel like I'm messing everything up. Amanda closed her notebook quietly. Thank you for telling me all that. You did very well. Ethan looked up. Did I say the right things? There's no right or wrong, she said. Only what's true. The session ended shortly afterward, and Ethan was escorted back to the waiting area where Rachel stood up the moment she saw him. He walked to her and hugged her tightly, burying his face in her side. She placed her hand gently on his back, not asking questions, not speaking. Just holding him. In the courtroom, later that afternoon, Amanda Kessler gave her preliminary findings in private chambers to Judge Holloway. Her assessment was firm. Ethan had been subject to emotionally coercive behaviors that had escalated over time. While there was no physical abuse, the psychological pressure and conditional affection had led to elevated anxiety, suppression of self-expression, and internalized guilt. She recommended that any visitation with Daniel, if granted, be monitored and limited until further evaluation could be completed. She also suggested that Ethan begin therapy immediately and that Rachel be the primary caregiver during this transitional period. Judge Holloway thanked her and reviewed the notes again before calling both legal teams into the courtroom for a closed-door update. When all parties had returned, he addressed them with gravity. This is not yet a final custody ruling, he stated. But the evidence submitted and the testimony provided have raised legitimate concerns about the minor child's emotional safety. Until further notice, full temporary custody is awarded to Rachel Parker. Supervised visitation may be arranged for Daniel Parker pending compliance with psychological evaluation and court-approved behavioral therapy. Rachel felt the world shift under her feet. Claire squeezed her hand discreetly. Daniel stood frozen, barely blinking. Greeley began to speak, but Daniel raised a hand to stop him. For the first time, there was no protest, no defense, no smug remark. Just silence. Judge Holloway continued. Let me be clear. This court does not take lightly the removal of parental access. But the well-being of a child is not a negotiation. And we do not barter love for loyalty. This is a chance to correct course, Mr. Parker. I suggest you take it. The gavel struck. Court was adjourned. The doors opened, but no one moved immediately. Rachel didn't cry. She simply reached for Ethan's hand and walked out of the courtroom, not looking back. For the first time since the beginning of this ordeal, she didn't feel like she was surviving. She felt like she was protecting. And Ethan, walking quietly beside her, seemed to feel it too. 2 days after the preliminary custody adjustment, the courtroom opened again, this time to allow submission of new evidence. Judge Holloway had made it clear in his last ruling, any pattern of behavior relevant to the child's emotional or psychological safety would be reviewed thoroughly before a final determination. With the psychologist's report already weighing heavily against Daniel, Rachel and Claire were ready to present additional documentation they had kept in reserve, the messages, call logs, and other pieces they had initially hesitated to bring forward. Now, with Ethan's emotional state exposed and validated, the time for holding back was over. Rachel sat in the hallway outside the courtroom, scrolling through the files on a thumb drive for the 100th time. The contents were painful, even after so many reviews. Voicemails, screenshots, timestamps. Things she had collected instinctively, not knowing if they would ever matter in court. Part of her had once hoped she'd never need to use them at all. Claire arrived with a nod, her expression calm but focused. Judge Holloway approved our motion. We'll start with the digital exhibits and go from there. The prosecution is also planning to submit their own set of findings. Apparently, the caseworker from DCS pulled Daniel's employment records and found some inconsistencies. Rachel frowned. Inconsistencies? Claire handed her a printout. Let's just say Daniel's calendar didn't always match the narrative he gave about how involved he was. Back in the courtroom, both legal teams prepared for a longer session. The judge had ordered that the court remain partially closed, media was barred, and only authorized individuals were permitted inside. Rachel sat beside Claire, and Ethan, though not required to testify again, was present at his own request. He had insisted on being there, not to speak, but to witness. I want to see how it ends, he had said. The first exhibit appeared on the large screen near the judge's bench. A series of text messages from Daniel to Rachel, spanning the 6 months following their divorce, began to scroll. Most were sharply worded, some passive-aggressive, others openly confrontational. But woven between the arguments were lines that made Rachel visibly shift in her seat. If Ethan ends up broken, it'll be on your conscience. Don't think you can turn him into a mama's boy without consequences. If he tells the court you're the better parent, I'll make sure they know how unstable you really are. Claire approached the monitor as she spoke. Your Honor, we're not just presenting anger or venting. These are direct attempts to manipulate the environment surrounding Ethan. The implication here is clear. Daniel Parker consistently sought to weaponize custody proceedings to punish Ms. Parker and intimidate the child's loyalty. The judge nodded, flipping through his own copy. Have these been verified? They were backed up directly from Ms. Parker's cloud storage. The metadata confirms the timestamps and phone numbers, Claire replied. Next came the call logs. While the judge didn't request the audio recordings themselves again, the transcribed summaries were entered into evidence. Voicemails from Daniel, often left late at night, contained phrases like, "You don't get to walk away from this family and keep the prize," and, "Tell your son that I'm watching what he says in court." Judge Holloway glanced up sharply. Was Ethan exposed to these messages? In at least 3 cases, he was present during live calls, Claire said. We also have statements confirming that he overheard several of these voicemails. We believe that contributed to the anxiety cited in Dr. Kessler's report. Greeley stood then, finally breaking his long silence. Your Honor, with respect, no child custody case is without emotional strain. Divorce is messy. Words are said. That doesn't amount to abuse. Claire didn't flinch. But it becomes abuse, Your Honor, when the words aren't random. When they're part of a consistent attempt to create emotional leverage. When they're followed by behavior that punishes a child for expressing affection for the other parent. That is not strain, that is strategy. Judge Holloway raised a hand. I've reviewed enough to agree that this is no longer about messy divorce dynamics. The evidence supports a deliberate pattern. Rachel sat motionless. Her breathing was shallow, but her focus stayed on the judge. She had been gaslit so many times that hearing someone finally affirm what she had always suspected felt surreal. The prosecution took the floor next. A representative from the district office stepped forward with a folder. Your Honor, we've conducted a preliminary timeline analysis comparing Mr. Parker's testimony with his travel records and financial disclosures. We found that many of the days he claimed to be caring for Ethan, including holidays and school breaks, he was out of town for business or, in some cases, not even in the state. This raised immediate eyebrows in the room. According to payroll and card transaction history, Mr. Parker was in Dallas during the winter break he claimed to have spent with his son. He also booked a solo trip to Miami during spring break, when Ethan was allegedly under his care. Greeley interrupted, clearly irritated. That's circumstantial. Parents can work remotely. He could have arranged care for Ethan through others. But he didn't disclose that in court, the prosecutor countered. And when questioned during previous hearings, he portrayed himself as directly responsible for Ethan's care during those weeks. Judge Holloway tapped his pen on the bench slowly. This court takes misrepresentation very seriously, Mr. Parker. Especially when it concerns the welfare of a minor. Daniel remained stone-faced. For the first time, he didn't even glance toward Ethan. The next item entered into evidence was a summary from Ethan's school counselor. She had submitted a written statement at Rachel's request, detailing several sessions with Ethan over the past year. In the statement, the counselor described a boy who often second-guessed his own preferences, who hesitated to speak about his weekends with his father, and who often said things like, "I don't want to make anyone mad." She concluded her testimony with the following sentence: "In my professional opinion, Ethan exhibits classic signs of being caught in a loyalty bind, struggling between maintaining emotional safety and pleasing a parent who uses conditional approval as a form of control." Judge Holloway sat back, quiet. He looked at Daniel, then at Ethan, and finally at Rachel. "We are nearing the final phase of this case," he said. "And with every new piece of evidence, one thing becomes increasingly clear. The child at the center of this has not only been pressured but placed in a deeply unfair emotional position. A position that could have long-term consequences if not properly addressed." He turned to Greeley. "If your client has anything else to present that might challenge this narrative, I suggest he do it soon. Because right now, the court is leaning heavily toward a final ruling that includes protective measures beyond a standard custody arrangement." Greeley sat, defeated. Daniel's hands were clenched together on the table, knuckles white. The judge called for an adjournment until the following morning. As Rachel and Ethan left the room once again, they didn't speak. But there was a shared look between them, not relief, not yet. But recognition. The storm was almost over. The damage had been surveyed, exposed. And now, finally, the truth behind the facade was no longer theirs to carry alone. When the courtroom doors opened the next morning, a tense hush spread across the room. From the moment the judge called the proceeding to order, everyone sensed the breakthrough wasn't over yet. The past days had revealed manipulative recordings, chilling messages, school counselor testimony. Now, a new witness was poised to shift the narrative further. Rachel and Claire sat close, hands clasped, as the courtroom staff announced the arrival of Sarah Winters, the ex-girlfriend of Daniel. Her presence summoned murmurs in the gallery. Her testimony had the potential to pierce the remaining veneer of Daniel's composed facade. Sarah stepped forward, her posture restrained but resolute. In the calm voice that filled the courtroom, she began describing moments she'd witnessed, not as an enemy to Daniel, but as someone who had once trusted him. "I saw him rehearse Ethan's lines," she began. The room quieted. Before every hearing, he would sit Ethan down and tell him exactly what to say, what to repeat to the judge. It always sounded like coaching. Like he was scripting a performance, not letting a boy speak freely. Daniel's lawyer, Greeley, quickly rose, attempting to discredit her account. "With all due respect, Your Honor, this is hearsay from an ex-relationship. There's no formal record or context. She could be biased." But Judge Holloway's expression remained neutral. "Please continue, Ms. Winters." Sarah swallowed, steadying her voice. "There was a time Ethan came to me after a session. He looked scared, and he said, 'I think I'm saying what Dad wants, but I don't know what I really feel.' He whispered it. He was 13, but in that moment, he sounded older, like he was trying not to cry. That stuck with me." At these words, Ethan bowed his head slightly. Rachel gripped his hand as a single tear escaped her eye. The gallery sat still. Greeley interjected again, "No documentation. Just an anecdote." Judge Holloway lifted a hand. "I am not dismissing it for lack of documentation." "Why?" "Because it corroborates the broader pattern already documented in this case, the recordings, the texts, Dr. Kessler's evaluation, the counselor's statement. Multiple threads weaving a consistent pattern." Greeley sat down sharply. It was clear the court was listening. The judge then addressed both sides. We've heard from experts, educators, a child. We've seen digital trails and patterns. Ms. Winters now offers observational context that deepens our understanding of intent. That matters. He paused. I want to be clear, this court's priority remains the child's safety and freedom to express truth without fear. This isn't about punishment or resentment, it's about recognizing and rectifying when a child's voice has been muffled. He called for the next piece of evidence. The prosecution presented a timeline showing Daniel's rehearsals and behavior around court dates, paired with behavioral changes in Ethan's school performance and emotional notes from his counselor. It was subtle but meaningful. Grades dipped, participation in class waned, and a previously enthusiastic boy seemed to shrink in his own skin before court sessions. Judge Holloway studied the timeline, then glanced at Ethan, who was watching, still composed yet fragile. There is now ample evidence, an evolving, multi-source pattern. From recordings, messages, expert evaluations, first-hand observations, and behavioral shifts, this is more than conflict. This is emotional manipulation. The judge directed Greeley to submit any final arguments, but the lawyer's voice was less confident, subdued now. Daniel's composure flickered, anxiety replacing arrogance. As the hearing recessed, Rachel and Ethan exited side by side. No words were exchanged, but each looked toward a future growing more secure. Behind them, Daniel lingered at the bench, face pale, betrayed by vulnerability instead of pride. Outside the courtroom, Ethan paused and turned to his mother. She said, I didn't know how I felt. That's how I felt. Rachel hugged him, tight and protective. In this moment, the truth wasn't just acknowledged, it was unfolding, piece by deliberate piece. And it belonged not to the one who shouted loudest, but to the one brave enough to speak gently. The final stretch of the custody proceedings had arrived, and although Ethan had not been scheduled to speak again, he had asked to do so. Not through his attorney, not through documents or intermediaries, he wanted to face the court directly. Judge Holloway, after reviewing the psychologist's recommendations and Ethan's maturity level, had granted his request under controlled conditions. This wasn't an ordinary step, but none of this case had followed the ordinary path. That morning, the courtroom felt smaller than usual, even though it was filled with the same people. Rachel sat on the left side of the room, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Claire whispered something to her, likely procedural reassurance, but Rachel wasn't listening. Her eyes were fixed on the boy seated 2 chairs away from her, who was adjusting the sleeves of his sweatshirt like he was preparing for a conversation far too big for someone his age. Daniel sat on the opposite side of the room. His posture was rigid, and though he tried to maintain composure, the stillness of his body betrayed a new, quiet tension. Greeley barely spoke now unless prompted. The momentum of the case had shifted days ago, and no legal strategy had managed to pull it back. The judge entered without fanfare and looked directly at Ethan, who stood at the center of the room, beside a court staff member assigned to monitor his well-being. There was no witness box this time, no raised dais, just a simple chair placed before the judge's bench, and a microphone resting on a small table. Ethan, Judge Holloway said, you asked to speak today. You are under no obligation. Do you understand that? Yes, sir, Ethan replied. His voice was steady, but not loud. And you understand that your statements here today are not for performance, but to help the court understand your feelings. You are not being judged, nor are you being asked to make decisions that are not yours to carry. Ethan nodded. I understand. The judge leaned back. Then you may begin, whenever you are ready. Ethan took a breath. I think, a lot of people have been talking about me. What I feel. What I need. What's best for me. And I know that's their job. But I also think maybe no one can say it better than I can. He glanced at both of his parents but did not linger on either. I've spent the last year trying to figure out how to make everybody happy. I told people what I thought they wanted to hear. Sometimes that was Mom. Sometimes Dad. Sometimes the court. I kept thinking if I said it right, if I was fair enough, maybe they'd stop fighting. He paused. But no matter what I said, they kept fighting anyway. And then I realized it's not about me saying the right thing. It's about people wanting to win. The courtroom was so quiet that the air itself seemed frozen. I don't want to pick sides. I didn't want to choose. I used to think choosing would break something. But now I know, not choosing breaks me. He looked directly at the judge. I want to live with my mom. Not because my dad is a bad person. But because when I'm with her, I feel like I get to be a kid. I don't feel like I have to carry all the weight. He looked down, then back up again. With my dad, it's like there's this invisible test. If I say the wrong thing, if I like something he doesn't, or if I miss him the wrong way, I feel like I failed. Rachel was barely holding back tears. Claire touched her arm gently, reminding her to stay silent. I'm tired of pretending I don't feel things just so someone doesn't get mad. I'm tired of being scared of messing up. Ethan's voice cracked slightly, but he continued. I still want to see my dad. I still love him. But I want to feel safe, and free to like both of my parents without having to be afraid of one of them. The judge nodded slowly, visibly affected by the calm sincerity of the boy in front of him. Thank you, Ethan, he said. You've shown this court more courage than many adults who sit in this room. You may return to your seat. As Ethan walked back, he passed his father without making eye contact. Daniel, unmoving, stared straight ahead, expression unreadable. But for the first time, the sharp confidence that had marked his face throughout these proceedings was gone. Judge Holloway addressed the room. This is not a case that hinges on a single testimony. But it would be a failure of this court not to acknowledge what we have just heard. When a child speaks not to manipulate but to reveal pain with clarity and dignity, we are obligated to listen. He turned to the attorneys. I will render my final judgment after closing arguments tomorrow morning. No further testimony will be heard. This court is adjourned until then. The gavel came down with finality. Outside the courthouse, Rachel and Ethan stepped into the afternoon sunlight. They didn't speak for several minutes, simply walking down the steps and away from the building that had come to define a year of their lives. Finally, Ethan said, "Do you think I said too much?" Rachel shook her head. You said the truth. That's never too much. He nodded, letting the words settle. Then he looked up at her. I think I'm ready for this to be over. Rachel wrapped an arm around his shoulders. So am I. And for the first time in many months, as they walked toward the parking lot, neither of them looked back. The following morning, while the courtroom prepared for the final round of arguments, something happened outside its walls that would add a layer of urgency to an already charged situation. Ethan and Rachel had arrived early, escorted by Claire, who insisted they avoid lingering in the front entrance due to increasing media presence. They were directed through a side hallway leading to the family room, where they would wait until the courtroom was opened. Daniel arrived 15 minutes later, alone. Greeley wasn't due for another half hour, and the courthouse lobby was only partially staffed. Security officers were spread throughout the floor, but in that small window, a moment unfolded in the corridor behind the hearing chambers, a moment no one expected and no one intended to become part of the case. Ethan had stepped out to get a drink from the water fountain at the end of the hallway. It was a simple act, the kind of routine movement that felt safe again after weeks of courtroom protection. But as he leaned down to press the button, a voice behind him stopped him cold. You don't know what you've just done. Ethan straightened up slowly, not turning around immediately. He recognized the voice without question. It was Daniel, his father, standing just a few feet behind him. The tone was quiet, but sharp, and laced with something that was neither yelling nor calm. It was the voice Daniel used when he wanted to say something only once. Ethan turned to face him. Daniel stood with his hands in his pockets, posture casual, but his eyes intense. You think all of this ends with your little speech? Daniel continued, his voice low. You think this is just about who you live with? There are consequences for betrayal. Before Ethan could speak, a uniformed security officer turned the corner. He caught sight of them immediately and walked over. "Sir, you need to step away from the minor," the officer said, standing between Daniel and Ethan. "I was just talking to my son," Daniel said, backing away with both hands raised. "Let's keep it to the courtroom," the officer replied firmly, escorting Ethan back toward the family waiting area. He didn't need to ask if something was wrong. Ethan's pale face said everything. 10 minutes later, the security office reviewed the hallway camera. The footage had no sound, but it showed enough: Daniel following Ethan, standing too close, speaking with a face that twisted into something tense, even sinister. Ethan's body language was defensive. The encounter was clearly not a benign exchange. Within 30 minutes, the report landed on Judge Holloway's desk. The judge called for a private pre-session with both attorneys and court security. Rachel and Ethan waited outside the room again, unaware of the incident's ripple effect. When Claire returned, her face was unreadable. "What is it?" Rachel asked immediately. Claire looked at Ethan. "We'll be addressing something new today. Nothing for you to worry about, but I want you both to know what happened in the hallway." The judge saw the footage. "It's being added to the record." Rachel's breath caught. Ethan looked down. "He didn't touch me," he said. "That doesn't matter," Claire replied gently. "It wasn't about touch. It was about intimidation. It was about sending a message." But the court heard it loud and clear. Inside the courtroom, proceedings resumed as planned. On the surface, Greeley attempted to open with his final remarks, but Judge Holloway cut in before he could finish his second sentence. "Before we proceed, Mr. Parker, stand." Daniel rose slowly. He glanced toward the back of the room, where Ethan sat beside Rachel, flanked by a second security officer now assigned to his protection. "This court has reviewed footage from earlier today in which you, despite standing orders and common ethical sense, approached your son alone and spoke to him in a manner that, while not recorded with sound, was clearly confrontational. Your expression, posture, and his visible reaction support this court's assessment that the contact was unwanted and inappropriate." Greeley tried to interject. "Your Honor, with respect." "Silence," the judge said flatly. "We are not entertaining any justification for this behavior." He turned his attention back to Daniel. "You were given the opportunity to remain part of this boy's life under strict conditions. That opportunity is now under serious review. You have demonstrated once again an unwillingness to honor the court's boundaries, or your son's emotional safety." Daniel didn't respond. Judge Holloway continued. "This incident reinforces what we've seen from the beginning, an ongoing attempt to assert control. But what you don't seem to understand is that this isn't your story anymore. This court is not here to validate your pride or reward your persistence. We are here for the child." The room was silent. Claire rose to deliver her final argument. She didn't pace. She didn't raise her voice. She spoke plainly. This case was never about one parent being perfect or the other being unfit. It was about listening to a child who was losing his voice in a battle of adults. The evidence is overwhelming. Ethan has been emotionally manipulated, frightened into silence, and used as a tool in a campaign of control. He found the courage to speak. And when he did, he was threatened again, right here, in this courthouse. If that is not reason enough to protect him permanently, then we have misunderstood everything about what justice is supposed to do. The judge nodded once. "Thank you, Ms. Bowman." Greeley stood but hesitated. There was no speech. No defense. Just a brief statement, "We rest." Daniel sat still, his jaw tight. For the first time, he looked like a man who understood what was slipping away. The judge announced that he would deliver his final decision the next morning, after reviewing the full scope of the case with Child Services and the assigned psychological evaluators. He ordered Daniel to refrain from any contact with Ethan outside of formal court proceedings. Any violation would trigger immediate legal consequences. As the court adjourned for the day, Ethan stood and turned to Rachel. "I thought it was over yesterday." She placed a hand gently on his shoulder. "Now it will be. Tomorrow, we walk out of here and don't look back." But as they left the courtroom under escort, Rachel knew one thing with certainty: what had happened in that hallway would be the final nail. Not just in the case, but in the silent, painful war Ethan had been forced to fight. Tomorrow, the verdict would come. But today, the court had already seen the truth. Again. The courthouse was quiet the next morning. Despite the weight of what had occurred over the past weeks, Ethan's testimony, Daniel's repeated transgressions, the damning hallway incident, no one could shake the feeling that something still lingered beneath the surface. The judge had yet to issue his final verdict, and while everyone anticipated a strong leaning in Rachel's favor, Claire remained cautious. Final decisions aren't just about the most recent behavior, she reminded Rachel while they waited outside the courtroom. They're about patterns. Long-term impact. What we're building is compelling, but if the court finds further evidence, even tangential, it could solidify everything. Rachel nodded, trying to suppress her nerves. Ethan sat beside her with headphones in, not listening to music, but using them as a wall, a simple shield from the stares and whispers of the hallway. A court officer approached moments later with a message. The judge is requesting counsel in chambers. Both attorneys. Claire stood immediately. Wait here. Rachel didn't move. She just squeezed Ethan's hand once before letting go. Inside the judge's chambers, Holloway stood at his desk, not seated. His expression was more serious than before, even considering the gravity of the case. He handed a file to Claire and one to Greeley, who had arrived just moments after her. This morning, the judge began, an anonymous packet was delivered to the court clerk's office. Contained within it were sealed documents from a prior family court case involving Mr. Daniel Parker. That file has now been officially unsealed with the consent of the judge who presided over the previous matter. The content is relevant. Extremely. Claire flipped through the pages, her brows furrowing with every line she read. Greeley remained unusually quiet. Is this, Claire hesitated, another custody battle? Yes, Holloway replied. From 7 years ago. Mr. Parker has a son from a previous marriage. His name is Caleb. The case was closed with a joint custody resolution, but within a year, the mother, Danielle Price, petitioned for full custody, citing patterns of emotional abuse and manipulative behavior nearly identical to what we've seen here. The boy was 9 at the time. Claire kept reading. It was disturbingly familiar. Attempts by Daniel to isolate the child from the mother, veiled threats tied to loyalty, overcorrection of behavior, frequent outbursts followed by periods of silence or conditional affection. The documents included psychologist notes, transcripts, even a written letter from Caleb, now 16, explaining how he felt programmed to act a certain way around his father. Why wasn't this disclosed earlier? Claire asked. Sealed records, the judge said. The mother moved out of state and restricted access to the case. It was never flagged in our jurisdiction because there was no formal record of Daniel violating any criminal statute. But the emotional pattern is now undeniable. Greeley, clearly shaken, attempted a half-hearted protest. With all due respect, Your Honor, that case was closed. Settled. It's not standard to allow prior family matters to weigh in on current decisions. It is, Holloway said, when the patterns are mirrored, and when the current case reveals escalating behavior. This court is not here to punish history, but when history repeats, it must be acknowledged. He returned to his seat. I will resume the hearing in 20 minutes. Ms. Bowman, prepare to reference this file if needed. Mr. Greeley, advise your client accordingly. The contents of this file may very well determine the outcome of today's ruling. Outside the chambers, Claire rejoined Rachel and Ethan with the file still in hand. There's something you both need to know, she said, kneeling slightly to face Ethan directly. You're not the first person your father's done this to. He has another son. Older than you. And your dad went through a custody battle before. A very similar one. Ethan blinked slowly, his mouth barely opening. Another son? Rachel stared at Claire, stunned. Why didn't he ever say anything? Claire stood. Because he didn't want anyone to know. But someone from that case, maybe the mother, maybe even the son, sent this to the court anonymously. And now it's officially part of the record. Ethan sat back, clearly reeling. He has a brother? Rachel whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. A teenager? The courtroom reconvened shortly after, and the judge wasted no time laying the new development before the record. This morning, new evidence was submitted from a prior family court case involving Mr. Parker, Judge Holloway announced. The contents of that case support a long-term pattern of behavior that aligns with current findings. For the record, all prior sealed content has now been entered into this court's file with judicial approval. Gasps whispered through the gallery. Daniel remained stoic, though his grip on the table edge betrayed a deep tension. Claire stood and addressed the court. Your Honor, we now have evidence that Mr. Parker's behavior was not situational or reactionary, but repetitive, part of a larger pattern spanning multiple relationships and children. It is no longer a matter of interpretation. It is fact. The judge turned to Daniel. Mr. Parker, do you wish to respond? Daniel rose, voice lower than usual. That case was years ago. It ended in joint custody. I was never found guilty of any abuse. No, Judge Holloway replied, but you were removed from unsupervised contact shortly after, due to patterns of coercive behavior. Do you deny that? Daniel didn't answer. The judge continued. We are not here to relitigate the past. But we are here to protect the present, and ensure a safe future. He then looked directly at Ethan. What would you say if you had the chance to meet your brother? The judge asked gently. Ethan's eyes widened. I think I'd want to know if he felt the same way I do. So I wouldn't feel like it was just me. The judge nodded slowly, taking those words in with visible weight. Very well, he said. This court will issue its final ruling tomorrow morning. But let this be known, there are no more shadows to hide in. He struck the gavel once. Court was adjourned for the day. As Rachel and Ethan stepped outside, a wind swept through the courtyard, the kind of wind that carries change on its back. They didn't speak much on the ride home. But Ethan stared out the window, processing what he had learned. He had a brother. And that brother had once been exactly where he was now. It didn't feel like the end anymore. It felt like the beginning of the truth. The next morning, the courtroom was more silent than it had ever been. There were no television crews out front anymore, no murmuring gallery of curious observers. Everyone present now had a purpose, a role, and a reason to be there. The entire proceeding had taken on a new weight. What had begun as a custody dispute had grown into a reckoning, one that reached far beyond the individuals seated on either side of the courtroom. Ethan sat between Rachel and Claire. He wasn't wearing headphones today. He wasn't shrinking or avoiding glances. He was upright, quiet, watching. Rachel didn't speak to him, not because she didn't want to, but because she understood. He was ready to face whatever came. Daniel was already seated when they arrived. His expression was unreadable, not the calm confidence he once displayed, nor the hostility that had leaked through his smiles in earlier sessions. Today, he looked like a man waiting for a sentence. Greeley sat beside him with no notes, no files open, and no anticipation of changing anything that had already been decided. Judge Holloway entered promptly at 9 o'clock in the morning, but instead of delivering his verdict immediately, he requested one final round of closing statements. Not out of necessity, but out of respect, for the boy at the center of it all, and for the gravity of what the court was about to decide. Claire stood first. Your Honor, she began, her voice measured and steady, we've submitted a great deal of evidence over these proceedings. We've heard testimony, seen timelines, reviewed psychological reports, and uncovered behavior that spans not only this case, but extends into Mr. Parker's past. We've heard the voice of a 13-year-old boy who found the courage to speak when no one else could speak for him. She stepped closer to the judge's bench. But beyond the evidence, there is one question this court must answer. Not about legality or precedent, but about principle. What does safety look like for a child who has learned to hide his thoughts to keep peace in a room? What does protection mean for a boy who had to record his own father just to be believed? Rachel lowered her eyes briefly. Ethan did not. Claire continued, "We are not asking the court to punish Daniel Parker. We are asking the court to protect Ethan Parker. That protection begins by listening to him and ends by honoring what he has made crystal clear. He does not feel safe. Not emotionally. Not psychologically. Not relationally. And that alone should be the court's compass." She paused, then stepped back to her seat. The judge turned to Greeley. "Mr. Greeley, if your client wishes to make a final statement, now is the time." Greeley stood, glancing at Daniel once. "Your Honor, we acknowledge the court's findings and the weight of the information presented. We understand the concerns that have been raised. My client regrets the impact his behavior has had, and—" Daniel raised a hand slightly. "I'd like to speak for myself." Greeley hesitated, but stepped back. The courtroom waited as Daniel stood. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. His eyes moved between the judge, his son, and the floor. Finally, he spoke. "When this started, I thought it was about fairness. I thought I was being shut out, and I fought back the only way I knew how, by trying to win. I thought if I could keep control, I could keep my place in my son's life." He looked toward Ethan. "But I didn't see what I was doing to you. Not really. I thought I was protecting my rights, but I wasn't listening to yours." Ethan's face remained neutral. Daniel continued, voice more strained. "I don't expect forgiveness. And I don't know what kind of relationship we'll have from here. But if the court believes the best thing for Ethan is not to be with me right now, I won't fight it." Silence. The judge nodded once, then turned back to his bench. He folded his hands. "Over the past 10 days, this court has reviewed extensive evidence, not only of behavior, but of harm. We have observed a child who has shown extraordinary strength in the face of subtle and sustained pressure. We have seen that this case is not about fitness in the traditional sense, but about safety, emotional, psychological, and developmental." He looked to Ethan, and his voice softened. "Ethan, you have carried a burden no child should have to carry. But you carried it with dignity, and you've helped this court see more clearly." Then, to the court. "This court hereby grants full physical and legal custody of Ethan Parker to Rachel Parker. Daniel Parker is granted visitation rights contingent upon completion of a full psychological evaluation and a 6-month therapeutic reintegration program monitored by a state-appointed therapist. Visitation will be supervised until such a time as the court determines it is safe to alter these terms." Rachel inhaled deeply, closing her eyes. Ethan reached for her hand. The judge wasn't finished. "This is not a punishment, Mr. Parker. This is a course correction. Parenting is not ownership. It is stewardship. You were entrusted with something fragile, and this court hopes you will take this opportunity to reflect, to learn, and to repair." He looked back to Ethan. "And to you, Ethan, I want you to know, none of this is your fault. You were never meant to be the adult in the room. And it is this court's intention that, from today forward, you never have to be again." The gavel came down. It was over. There was no eruption of emotion, no dramatic outburst. Just a collective exhale, like the tension of the past year had finally found a place to rest. Daniel did not protest. He simply sat down, eyes glazed, as Greeley gathered their papers. Rachel turned to Ethan and placed her hands on his cheeks. "You did it." Ethan smiled faintly, then leaned into her arms. As they stepped out of the courtroom into the sunlight, the weight that had clung to them for so long seemed to lift, just slightly. The fight was over. The system had seen him, heard him, and finally, believed him. They didn't need to look back. Because what waited ahead was finally theirs to define. It had been only 48 hours since Judge Holloway's final decision, and already, Rachel had begun to sense the shift. Not just in legal terms, the formal transfer of full custody, the cease of combative communication, but in the subtle weight that seemed to leave Ethan's shoulders little by little. Their house was quieter, not in a hollow way, but in the absence of fear. the silence no longer felt like waiting for a storm. It was the kind that came after one. Ethan had asked to return to school the next day, and Rachel, despite her protective instincts, agreed. She walked him to the gates herself, lingering a little longer than usual before letting him go. He turned once, gave her a slight nod, not quite a smile, but not nothing. He was trying to be okay. And maybe for the first time in months, that was beginning to feel possible. But peace, Rachel would learn, often arrived hand in hand with uncertainty. That afternoon, Claire called unexpectedly. "There's something you need to hear," she said. Rachel was standing in the kitchen, halfway through cleaning out the fridge, the sound of running water still in the background. "It's over, Claire." It was. But Daniel submitted a last-minute proposal through Greeley. Rachel's stomach sank. "He's appealing?" "No," Claire said quickly. "Not formally. He's requesting a modification. An alternative agreement." Rachel's confusion deepened. "What kind of agreement?" Claire paused on the line. "He wants to propose shared custody again. On one condition." Rachel's voice tightened. "What condition?" "That you meet with him. In person. Privately. No lawyers." Rachel dropped the sponge in the sink. "Is he serious?" "Apparently. He claims he's ready to talk, not to threaten. He says he wants to rebuild trust for Ethan's sake." "After everything he's done?" Claire sighed. "I advised against it, obviously. The judge's ruling is final. He can't overturn it without an appeal, and he doesn't have the grounds for one. But I thought you should know. He's pushing for an informal, off-record conversation to try and change how the court views him." Rachel leaned against the counter, heart pounding. She knew Daniel too well to think this was about reconciliation. He wanted something. He always did. And yet, some part of her hesitated, not because she believed him, but because Ethan might. "I need to think about it," Rachel said. Later that evening, she sat across from Ethan in the living room. He was sketching quietly, drawing some kind of futuristic cityscape, the lines sharp and mechanical, but full of imagination. She waited until he looked up before speaking. "Ethan," she said gently, "your dad, he asked to talk to me." "Just me." Ethan's pencil stopped. "What for?" "He says he wants to try and work something out. For your sake." Ethan stared at her for a long moment. "Do you want to?" Rachel didn't answer right away. "No. But I don't want you to feel like I made that decision without you." He thought for a moment. "If you go, would it change anything? Legally?" "No." "Emotionally?" "I don't know." Ethan nodded slowly. "If you do, just don't let him twist it. Don't let him make it your fault again." "I won't." 3 days later, Rachel agreed to meet Daniel in a public setting, with a court liaison nearby for safety. They sat across from each other in a private conference room at a mediation center, no microphones, no recorders, but eyes and ears just outside the door. Daniel looked tired. Not defeated, but older. For once, he didn't try to open with charm or wit. He simply said, "Thank you for coming." Rachel didn't respond. He continued, "I've been doing a lot of thinking. I'm not proud of how things went. I let things spiral." "You didn't let anything spiral," Rachel said calmly. "You controlled the spiral." Daniel leaned forward. "I know you don't believe me, but I'm trying to understand it now. What I did to Ethan. I didn't see it for what it was. I just thought I was being strong. Making him strong." Rachel's voice remained level. "He didn't need strength. He needed space to be a kid." Daniel rubbed his face. "I want to fix it." "You can't." "I want to try." Rachel leaned back in her chair, folding her arms. "Is this why you asked for this meeting? To perform regret and get supervised visitation turned into shared weekends?" Daniel shook his head. "No. I wanted to see if you'd even listen." She was quiet. Then she said, "You have 6 months of supervised visits, a mandated therapist, and a boy who still flinches every time someone raises their voice. If you're serious about trying, prove it there." Daniel nodded slowly. "Do you think he hates me?" Rachel took a moment before answering. "No. But I think he's learning not to need your approval. And I think that scares you." Daniel looked away. "What happens now?" "You follow the court order. You don't call him. You don't text him. You don't show up anywhere uninvited. You go to therapy. You show progress. Maybe then he'll want to talk again." There was a long silence between them. Finally, Daniel said, "Do you think he'll forgive me?" Rachel stood, gathering her bag. "That's not mine to answer. That's between you and him. And it starts with not asking for it." As she left the room, she didn't look back. Back at home, she found Ethan in the backyard, sitting with a notebook in his lap, his face turned toward the early evening sky. She sat beside him in the grass, saying nothing at first. Then, after a moment, she said, "I went." Ethan nodded. "What did he say?" "That he wants to change. That he wants to try." Ethan didn't respond right away. Then he asked, "Do you believe him?" Rachel looked at the notebook in his lap. "I believe people can try. But trying doesn't fix what already happened." He nodded, closing the notebook. "I'm tired of being angry." "You don't have to forgive him yet." "I know. But I don't want to carry him forever." Rachel reached out and touched his shoulder. "You won't have to. Not anymore." It had been nearly 3 weeks since Rachel and Daniel's final meeting. Weeks in which Ethan settled into a rhythm of life that felt closer to peace than he had known in a long time. There were no courtrooms now, no sudden phone calls from lawyers, no looming tension behind closed doors. His days were filled with school, therapy sessions, long walks with his mom, and hours spent drawing in his bedroom, sometimes alone, sometimes while Rachel read quietly nearby. But in the background, the court's final procedures still played out. Judge Holloway had made it clear the ruling was final, but official closure required final documentation, therapist updates, and confirmation that the supervised visitation framework was being implemented. It was in that interim period, a liminal space between decision and normal life, that one last hearing was scheduled. This one, Judge Holloway said, was not to relitigate. It was to speak plainly, in the presence of both parents, about what the court expected from here on out. Rachel was reluctant to attend. Ethan, even more so. But the judge insisted the boy be allowed to decline formal participation. Ethan exercised that right, choosing instead to write a letter he asked Claire to read aloud in court. On the morning of the hearing, Rachel arrived with Claire, calm but alert. Daniel had already taken his place, this time accompanied not by Greeley, but by a quiet, plain-looking court-appointed attorney, standard practice now that his role in Ethan's life was conditional. Daniel looked different. Not only tired, but smaller somehow. His eyes were not searching for allies or strategies. He simply waited. Judge Holloway entered without delay and opened the session with no formalities. This court has made its ruling clear: full legal and physical custody of Ethan Parker rests with his mother, Rachel Parker. Visitation rights granted to Mr. Parker are contingent upon consistent therapy, written updates from his counselor, and 0 violations of the no-contact order outside supervised sessions. He looked down at a paper in front of him. Today's purpose is to conclude this case publicly, on the record, and to ensure that all parties understand both the boundaries and the responsibilities moving forward. He turned to Claire. "Ms. Bowman, you mentioned the child submitted a written statement?" "Yes, Your Honor. Ethan has asked me to read it aloud on his behalf." The judge nodded. Claire stood and unfolded a single sheet of paper. Her voice was even, but softened slightly as she read the boy's words. "My name is Ethan Parker. I'm 13. I asked not to come to court today because I don't want to hear people talk about me like I'm not in the room. But I wrote this because I want my voice to still matter. I don't want to be in the middle of my parents anymore." I don't want to be part of a fight. I don't want to have to make anyone happy or lie about what I feel. I just want to live in a home where I don't have to pretend I'm okay when I'm not. I love my dad, but I need space. Not because I want to hurt him, but because I want to heal. I want to know who I am without having to choose sides. If he wants to be in my life, I need him to respect the version of me that doesn't belong to him, or to anyone else. Thank you for listening to me. I hope you keep listening to kids like me, even when we're quiet. Sometimes we're quiet because we're scared. But we're still telling the truth. Rachel's throat tightened. She kept her gaze forward, but her hands trembled slightly in her lap. Claire folded the letter and sat down. Judge Holloway sat back in his chair, visibly moved. Let the record show that this court recognizes Ethan Parker's statement as both a declaration of personal boundaries and a remarkable example of emotional maturity. The clarity of his words reaffirms the necessity of the ruling rendered. He turned his attention to Daniel. Mr. Parker, the court understands that change is a process. Your progress will not be measured by words, but by consistent action. You are not being punished. You are being watched, for the sake of a child who gave this court more insight into his needs than most adults ever manage. Daniel nodded, not with resistance, but with a subdued acceptance. I understand. The judge addressed Rachel last. Ms. Parker, you are now the sole legal guardian of your son. That role is both a privilege and a burden. The court acknowledges the grace with which you have handled an impossible situation. Our systems are not perfect. But your advocacy for Ethan, calm, persistent, and rooted in his well-being, helped us see clearly. Rachel's voice caught as she replied, "Thank you, Your Honor." The judge gathered the papers before him. This case is now formally closed. All terms stand as written. Any attempt to violate or circumvent these terms will result in immediate legal action. If no infractions are reported within the next 12 months, and if progress is demonstrated through consistent reports from appointed professionals, the court will reassess visitation terms upon request. He paused. But for now, the court will do what Ethan asked us to do. He looked at the clerk. Listen. The gavel fell. The case was officially over. Outside the courtroom, Rachel met Ethan under the old elm tree that stood just beyond the courthouse parking lot. It had become something of a ritual, their place to reconnect after every hearing. He looked up from the bench where he sat. Saturday, is it done? She smiled and sat beside him. It's done. He didn't ask for details. She didn't offer any. Instead, he handed her a folded piece of paper. What's this? She asked. My copy, Ethan said. Of the letter. Just in case you ever need to remember what I sound like when I know what I want. Rachel unfolded the paper. His handwriting was neat but young, each letter formed with purpose. You know, she said, you don't always have to know what you want. That's what growing up is for. I know, Ethan replied. But I think I'm finally allowed to figure it out at my own speed. She pulled him gently into her side. He didn't resist. The sun dipped lower in the sky. No more hearings. No more decisions. Just the sound of wind through leaves and the slow, unhurried rhythm of healing. It had been nearly 4 months since the final gavel struck and the case closed. The courthouse was now a distant memory for Ethan, something that belonged to a different version of his life, one with closed doors and unspoken rules. That version had been replaced with something quieter, but also freer. The kind of quiet that allowed him to breathe, to ask questions, to exist without fear of choosing wrong. Rachel had moved them into a new house on the outskirts of town, a 2-bedroom bungalow surrounded by tall trees and a wide-open yard where Ethan had set up a hammock between 2 oaks. The house wasn't bigger, but it felt that way because there was nothing left in it that didn't belong. No hidden recordings. No tense glances toward the front door. No feeling that someone could take everything away with one accusation. Ethan's school life had stabilized. He was no longer the subject of whispers in the hallway. His grades were steady, his focus sharper, and his sessions with the school counselor were now monthly rather than weekly. He talked more, not just in therapy, but at home, about small things, about the books he was reading, about an art project he had started. He still didn't talk much about Daniel, but Rachel didn't press him. She knew healing didn't always need an audience. One Sunday morning, while Rachel sipped coffee on the porch, Ethan approached her with a folded piece of paper in his hand. She looked up, her eyes questioning but calm. "It's from Caleb," Ethan said. Rachel sat up straighter. "Your brother?" Ethan nodded. "Half-brother." "But yeah." Rachel took the note and unfolded it slowly. The handwriting was messy but deliberate. The letter was short. "Hey Ethan. Your mom found my mom online. I guess we were both in court for the same reasons, just years apart. I just wanted to say I'm sorry for what you went through. I get it. Really. If you ever want to talk, here's my number. Caleb." Rachel looked at Ethan. "Do you want to call him?" "I already did," he said, sitting beside her. "We talked last night." She blinked in surprise. "What was it like?" "Strange at first. Then kind of easy. Like I didn't have to explain everything. He just knew." Rachel reached over and brushed a leaf off his shoulder. "And how did it feel?" Ethan shrugged, but not in dismissal. "It felt like I wasn't alone. And not in a sad way. Just, like someone else made it through." They sat together for a while, watching squirrels leap between the trees. Rachel eventually said, "Would you ever want to meet him?" Ethan nodded. "We talked about it. Maybe this summer." Rachel smiled softly. "I think that's a good idea." Later that week, Ethan brought up Daniel for the first time in weeks. They were walking through a nearby park when he stopped beside the creek and asked, "Do you think he's really going to change?" Rachel answered honestly, "I don't know. I think change is hard, even when people want it." He nodded. "Do you think I'll ever be ready to see him again?" Rachel looked at him carefully. "Only you can know that. And whenever you are, or even if you never are, it'll be your choice." Ethan thought for a moment, then said, "I don't hate him. I just don't trust him yet." "That's okay," Rachel said. "Those are two very different things." They continued walking, the conversation drifting toward easier topics. They talked about what he wanted to do over the summer, whether they should adopt a dog, what books he was reading in English class. The world, once heavy with tension and threat, had expanded again. At night, Rachel watched Ethan from the hallway as he worked on a new drawing at his desk. It was a cityscape again, but this time the buildings were full of light, with windows open and people visible through them. It looked like a place where people wanted to live, not just survive. Ethan caught her watching and grinned slightly. "Too many windows?" "No," she said. "Just enough." In the weeks that followed, supervised visitation between Ethan and Daniel was reevaluated. The therapists involved reported that Daniel had been attending sessions consistently, participating earnestly, and showing signs of genuine self-reflection. But Ethan still declined the option to begin in-person visits. The court respected that, and the order remained unchanged. Caleb eventually visited. He came down from Oregon with his mother for a weekend, and the two boys met at a local art center for a summer workshop. They spent hours together, talking less about Daniel than Rachel expected, and more about shared interests, music, drawing, a video game they had both once been forbidden from playing. They weren't instant best friends, but there was a quiet understanding between them, a bridge that didn't need to be spoken aloud to be crossed. By August, Ethan had joined a weekend sketch group hosted by a local artist. He was learning perspective drawing, experimenting with ink, and talking about maybe applying for an arts magnet program the following year. Rachel drove him to each session, waiting outside with a book and a thermos of tea. One Saturday afternoon, as they drove home, Ethan turned to her and said, "You know, I don't feel broken anymore." Rachel glanced at him. "You were never broken." He smiled. "I used to think I was. That I had to pick which part of myself to keep. And now?" I think I get to keep all of me. That night, Rachel sat by herself on the porch, looking up at the stars. She thought of the courtroom. The judge. The recordings. The fear. The long months of waiting and wondering. And then she thought of her son, of the way he had found his voice, of how he stood up not just for himself, but for every kid who had ever felt like their truth wasn't loud enough. He was free now. Not because the court had granted custody, but because Ethan had finally granted himself the right to live on his own terms. No more choosing sides. No more silence. Only the quiet, steady rhythm of a new beginning, one day, one truth, one breath at a time. As the night deepened and the crickets began to sing, Rachel whispered to herself, "We made it." And in the room behind her, Ethan slept soundly, unafraid.